much, Jennifer and Todd. And having now heard a couple of frontiers, and I know the bar is set extraordinarily high, I hope that you all will find my remarks today intriguing. I'm actually going to tackle this in two parts. I want to talk a little bit about research topics that I have been working on myself and with students and collaborators for some time. That's our big question. I'll show it to you here in a moment. And then I want to take a few moments at the end, so my remarks might extend a little bit longer. I got permission from Todd to do this. Extend a little bit longer than is normal for Frontiers, because I want to talk about some thoughts that I have on the Institute. Now that I've been here about 6 weeks, I know enough to be dangerous. So I'll share some remarks with you about that at the end. Okay, so Frontiers is about big questions. So here's my big question. This question I've been working on for about 20 years. And I was thinking about this question last night, and I don't see why it would possibly take us 25 minutes to answer, because it's only about a global transformation and all of life on Earth. So surely the answer to this question is fairly straightforward. In fact, actually, I'm going to pull together a collection of thoughts and ideas and results toward this question. I'm going to try to answer it at the end, at least get us closer to the answer than we might be when we walked in the door. This topic, however, doesn't cover all of my research interests. In particular, I'm not going to be talking about some work that we do on climate change adaptation, collaborators and I do, on climate change that is more socioeconomic and more human-oriented. Today I'm going to focus on the biodiversity. So you'll see creatures, and we'll talk about plants and animals today, more than people, though people are going to be very important as well. So I do not need to tell this audience that the climate is changing, but I do want to remind you, because even I forget sometimes, how much. So the answer is a lot. If we follow a business as usual trajectory, climate models tell us that by the end of this century, over land, we might have temperatures in excess of, say, 5 or 6 degrees warmer than in the recent past. You know, colder at the poles, or warmer, more change at the poles. So what does this mean for organisms, however? Well, the last time that the world was this much cooler, about 6 degrees C cooler, we were in the middle of an ice age. So we had about, say, half a mile, maybe a little bit more than that, thick of ice sitting on top of us here in Minnesota. If you think about what were places like during the last ice age, let's take a spot that we think we know something about. Here's my example, Death Valley. It's a desert. It has plants and animals living there that are adapted to extraordinarily warm and dry conditions. But when the temperature was significantly cooler, it was dominated by mesic evergreen forests, a completely different biome, and all the creatures that we now think of as associated with Death Valley were living somewhere else altogether. And the creatures and the plants and animals that were there now, that were there then, are now somewhere else, if anywhere at all. The last time that CO2 concentration was similar to what we anticipate here in the next couple of decades, so the amount of climate warming that we could eventually have under our greenhouse gas emissions, there were relatives of alligators living near the poles. So I often tell my students, for example, and I will remind you, this is not, again, business as usual climate change is not slight modifications on the edges. This is reorganizing where things live on Earth. It's quite different. When we look out the window, we will see different things. Now, we know from the fossil record that a major or a dominant response of organisms when the climate changes is movement. For the most part, species, for example, at the end of the last ice age, changed what we call their geographic distribution, or where they live on Earth, as the climate warmed. There are some cases that where species went entirely extinct. This is one. This is a spruce tree that we think either didn't move fast enough or for some reason did not make it through this period of rapid climate change. We worry that under modern climate change, largely because of habitat modification from humans and the fact that the landscape is so different than from than it was, say, from the end of the last ice age, that this kind of species failing to shift, or failing to shift completely, or getting stuck in some places, or being diminished in some way, will become more common under modern climate change. So can we save biodiversity from climate change? What the heck does that mean anyway? It may mean, can we prevent entire species from going extinct, like the spruce, but I think it's much more nuanced than that. When we're thinking about biodiversity and what we're looking to conserve under climate change, or what values we're concerned about being affected or diminished by climate change, we need to look to genetic diversity. Might we lose some of the colors of life, if you will, the variety of life that's out there, while still, maybe in some cases, not losing entire species? A major concern to people is what kinds of ecosystem functions or ecosystem services might we lose or might change as organisms are reorganizing around us. So when I say save biodiversity under climate change, I mean thinking about preserving and managing for all of these values. And I'm going to talk about this biodiversity conservation using one word. I have worked on this word for a long time, and then someone, the entire discipline of climate science, came along and they stole it. So now it has two meanings. And in fact, I'm interested in both of those meanings. The first, to a biologist, is what is adaptation? It's evolutionary change. In the climate community, though, adaptation also refers to human adjustments. So I will talk about both of these concepts. We'll talk about adaptation from an organismal or evolutionary perspective. I'll talk about evolution, meaning adaptive changes in response to the environment, organisms becoming more or less fit in that environment, adaptive evolution becoming more fit for that environment. And when we talk about adaptation from a human point of view, I think we can really think of that as management. What steps are we going to take to manipulate or control or influence ecosystems as the climate changes? Now, these two are not independent from one another. In fact, a strategy of adaptation could be adaptation. In other words, we might manage biodiversity through adaptive means. We might actually exploit some of the features of adaptive evolution. And the flip, when we are managing species and ecosystems, we will need to consider their adaptive history and their potential for future adaptation as the climate changes. So hang with me that adaptation is both evolutionary biology and human management responses. Here are my 3 points. So after you see this slide, you can leave if you have other places to go. I'm going to try to answer this question at the end, so maybe those slides are worth seeing. But except for those slides, this is an important slide. Here are 3 things that I think are important, that I think are not fully appreciated in ecology and natural resource management. The first is, and I'm going to illustrate each of these with some examples. The first is that we should not assume that populations of a species are all the same. That sounds kind of obvious, but in fact, in almost all of the biodiversity planning and conservation work we do under climate change, we do exactly that. We assume that all populations of a species are the same. I'll show you why that's a problem. I want to talk about this idea of adaptive capacity of organisms and how we sort of don't understand completely what that is, but we really, really need to. And I'll talk about management strategies and how we need to wrap our heads around what are the options, management options for biodiversity. And then I will talk a little bit about unintended consequences. So if we try to build adaptive capacity or design and implement these strategies for biodiversity conservation, it will cause things to happen that maybe we don't want, and maybe some cases we don't know what they are. And I think it's very important to, what is this, the known knowns, the unknown knowns. We need to know that there are going to be some unknowns. So there will be some unintended consequences, and maybe we can get part of the way there by anticipating what they are and trying to think about how likely they might be. So this first point, let's not think that all populations are the same. I've spent a lot of time working on this point. I'm going to show you just one example of why it matters from a management point of view. I've done some work with some colleagues at the University of Helsinki. We've been doing some modeling of species. Here's one of those species that we've modeled. This is an federally endangered species called the Karner blue butterfly. It lives in the Great Lakes and New England, essentially, or the East Coast. It's probably more abundant in the past and covered more areas, but now occurs in the spots marked on this map. And what we've looked at this species and we've asked, using a series of analyses, what climates characterize this species. And what we've discovered is that western populations in Wisconsin, Minnesota, these regions, they occupy one climatic niche. They're living in a certain set of climatic characteristics. And that's different from the populations that live out here in the east. They're living under different climatic conditions. So we asked, what if you think of them, instead of one species, you think of them as a western form and an eastern form? And you imagine what will happen to them under climate change using some of the modeling techniques that we've used today. And this is what you get. I'm going to pop up some circles here to point you to what to look at. But first I want to lay out what you see on this slide. On the left-hand side, you see what happens if you think the Karner blue is one species. The populations are all the same. It lives in one common set of climatic conditions. We plug this into a model. We ask what the future climate will be using climate models from climate science, and we project out into the future where Karner might live. On the right-hand side is that same exercise, but you treat them as if they occupy two different climatic niches, populations that are not the same, but they might be, say, adapted to different climates. And what I will show you here, and so here the eastern comes up as blue and the western comes up as orange. You might see that when you treat them separately, and then these are time horizons, 2030, 2050, 2080. You might see when you treat them separately, there are differences in the total amount of area that you would predict this species could live. But there are also some differences in the actual spots where you would think that they would live. So think of managers going out there and doing conservation. Where should you do it? These two models would predict differently. So here I point to a region. Wow, this looks like a great spot by the middle of the century if you think of the species as a whole. But you wouldn't predict that spot at all if you think of them as separate, as distinctive. Or you might say, oh, look, the eastern form can hang on in the Appalachians in the future. But you wouldn't think that if you thought that this species was uniform across its range. So appreciating those population differences, those evolutionary histories that may actually make populations different and adapted to different climatic conditions and thus respond to climate change differently. That's one example of this point. My second point, we need to build adaptive capacity. To build adaptive capacity, we have to actually understand what it is. And then also, and relatedly, design effective techniques for intervening or for managing biodiversity under climate change if we wish to preserve some of those biodiversity values. Let's talk for a moment about what adaptive capacity is. In fact, adaptive capacity refers to both of these definitions of adaptation, both evolutionary and our own human ability. But let's focus on the evolutionary piece, adaptive capacity. What will happen there are basically three things an organism can do when the climate changes. Well, four, I suppose. It can die. It can go extinct. The changing condition is too much for it in a particular location, and it just dwindles to zero. Another possibility is it could move. It could go somewhere else. Here, I'm showing this as dispersal. Track the changing conditions. Another possibility is that it could evolve. It could change. It could respond if it has, say, enough genetic diversity to do so, and the change is not too dramatic. And then the third, which I do not depict on this slide, is that it could kind of tolerate it. We call this phenotypic plasticity. It may do this by adjusting its behavior or the timing that it does something, for example. But let's just think about moving or evolving. We can imagine this idea of adaptive capacity. Some co-authors and I talked about something called realized adaptive capacity and fundamental adaptive capacity. For those of you who are ecologists, these two terms, realized and fundamental, might mean something to you. It's a way we conceive of an ecological niche of an organism. A realized niche or a realized adaptive capacity is one that's constrained by the real world, interacting with other species. It's what you actually see out there of an organism's ability to move or evolve, given its context. Its fundamental adaptive capacity is something about the theoretical biological possibilities of this creature, which are not hardly ever realized in nature because of other ecological constraints. So what we might do in designing effective management techniques is think about how do we remove those things or alleviate those things that constrain the adaptive capacity of organisms toward realizing more of that theoretical fundamental potential of organisms to tolerate changing conditions on their own through, in this case, moving or evolving. So what could those things be? If you wanted to increase the realized adaptive capacity of organisms by affecting dispersal, you might remove dispersal barriers or connect habitats together. That makes them more able to adjust on their own in response to climate change. If you wanted to affect their adaptive capacity on the axis of evolution, you might do something like some breeding or genetic mixing to provide creatures with greater evolutionary potential. So these are the kinds of strategies that we might think about, and we argued that it's helpful to think about them and how do they affect an organism's adaptive capacity. However, there might be times when adaptive capacity is fundamentally constrained. You cannot build enough habitat connectivity, or you cannot convince the farmers to change their land use to make that habitat connectivity, for example. So you might need to do something more dramatic. Other intervention techniques, in addition to this, helping fulfill this fundamental adaptive capacity. Here's one example that I've spent a lot of time thinking about because it brings up all kinds of interesting issues. And that's something we call managed relocation. You may also have heard of it as assisted migration or assisted, Europeans tend to use assisted colonization. Managed relocation is the idea that people, again, that human management adaptive piece, adaptation piece, people would pick up something and help it disperse to a new location, overcome a dispersal limitation to a place we think it might live in the future. But we have reason to think it couldn't get there on its own, or maybe we just want to speed up that process by which it would get there. And you can imagine this in a unit, a biological unit. We might do this for a species, but we might also do it for a particular genetic type, a color, a growth form, something like this. Moving it to where we think that it was likely to live in the future. This idea has gotten a fair amount of attention in the media. This is an illustration that went with an article in the Boston Globe. It actually depicts a case of a rare and endangered species in the Bay Area where you imagine that the bay itself could be a barrier to dispersal. So this guy comes along and helps it over the Golden Gate Bridge. And I just think that this could be a sort of symbolic representation for lots of things at IonE. Because it's a solution. And the person who is doing it is relatively happy about this solution. But I think to pick a rodent, it's not a panda that they're just bringing over the Golden Gate, is on purpose, right? It's not, how do we feel about this? I'm not really sure. I think we're supposed to feel a little conflicted about this particular assisted migration or managed relocation activity, because it speaks to our values and what we care about and what does biodiversity even mean to us. This also has got some press in the New York Times. And speaking of easy questions to answer, this has got to be the easiest question I've ever seen written on the idea of managed relocation. This is an article about moving plants, and it says, is it wise or foolish to assist in the migration of plants? And this is one of those questions where the answer is yes. Absolutely yes. But in fact, doing managed relocation is more nuanced. Why would you do it? You would do it because it has some good things. Why wouldn't you do it? You would not do it because it has some bad things. So you would do it because you're worried that a species might entirely go extinct, be eliminated from the face of the earth. You might do it because there's some ecosystem good or service that you seek to enhance or to have in a new location, or you're worried that that service might not occur naturally in a location in the future. And why wouldn't you do it? Because you're going to wreak havoc. You're going to create pests. You might, this is the one that's gotten the most attention. I'll talk about it a little bit. But also you might worry that you're just going to make a bad situation worse. You're going to take that rare rodent and you're going to drive it to extinction by picking it up and removing it. And I think the third, and it's probably the most important reason, is that you might make investments in doing this and it might not be the right investment to make. That it will have opportunity costs. It might not be the best course of action. So thinking about managed relocation as an intervention technique is really about evaluating those pros and cons. And we've tried to tackle this from a number of different angles. Here are some examples. 2 examples. 1, what is the risk of creating a pest, of wreaking havoc? We introduce something to a new place and then we say, oh no, that was the wrong thing to do. A graduate student and I said, well, let's just look at current invasive species and ask how many of them are analogous to a sort of regional movement. So we built a database of invasive species, current invasive species, and we said, okay, well, how many of these invasive species come from within the continent, intracontinental, which is like analogous perhaps to managed relocation, versus come from someplace else. And that's not an analog for things moving around comparable. That's just downright invasive species, perhaps. So what I want you to see here is there's a lot of gray and not so much black. So, in fact, the black is about 14% of invasive species come from within the continent. So most of this risk of wreaking havoc comes from things that are far away. Now there are some definitional issues of invasive species that definitely influence our results, but let's set that aside for a moment. Here's the next thing I want you to see. We can rank those invasive species by how big of a deal they are. Not so bad to, wow, really impactful. And I want you to see that the amount of black is basically the same. So if it might be only 14%, relatively small number of invasive species come from somewhere nearby, it's just as likely that we might get a bad one as one that's not so bad. Furthermore, we looked at breaking these down by taxonomic group. Is there differential risk in different kinds of organisms? And the answer is yes. Plants, terrestrial plants have a very small percentage of what we call invasive species that come from within North America. But if you look at, say, freshwater organisms, you'll see a much larger percentage of species that come from within the continent. Probably because, this makes sense for those of you who are biologists, it's intuitive to think, right, you can stay within a continent and cross over meaningful barriers, say in major watersheds, more readily for freshwater species. Now, it would be really nice if we had lots of experiments and empirical data and models to tell us more about managed relocation, but we don't yet. So what we did is we said, what is the next best alternative? Well, let's ask experts what they think. We also were hearing a lot, this is a very controversial issue. So we wanted to know, well, what is the extent of the controversy? How do people feel about this? So we worked with a political scientist to do some expert survey work. I'm just going to show you a snapshot of some of the results. We asked lots of different kinds of things. There are a number of interesting things that we found. But what I want to show you here is we did eventually ask people a question. In the end, when it's all said and done, how do you feel about managed relocation? Do you like it? Do you not? Those are the results I show up here in the corner. Very few people love the idea. But interestingly, very few people also hate the idea, do not support it at all. And these are, I should say, these are published scientists. So these are corresponding authors in ecology and evolution journals. That's how we built our respondents list. So these are people who are supposed to know about life on Earth, ecologically and evolutionarily. And almost everybody is really not sure. Which, I guess if they're good scientists, they really should be, because the evidence isn't in yet. But that was surprising to us. I thought there would be more people who were completely opposed to it. Then we asked them, we gave them a variety of different situations. And one situation, here are 3 different particular cases. So now we're kind of poking and prodding at how they feel about this issue. And we asked them, for each of these cases, do you think managed relocation could be justified? Would it work? Would you support it? And then do you actually think it would be beneficial? Interestingly, people, they wouldn't think it, they would support it even though they don't think it would do any good. But setting that aside, I want you to see that the black and the gray and the white are quite different from one another. So one of them is an endangered butterfly, my Karner blue, for example. Would you support the idea of moving this endangered species to a new location? People say, yeah, I think that's justified. A lot of people say that's justified. It would probably work, and they would support it. Now, if we said, what about if it was a timber species? It's not threatened with endangerment at all, but it would grow better up there, and we could cut it down and make money off of it. People say, no. Much fewer of them say that's justified. It would work, but fewer of them would support it. The third case is one where we imagine species interacting with one another. We said, what if we're concerned about corals? But actually, to save corals, what you would do is you would move the symbiont that's temperature sensitive, so a little bit more nuanced. They thought that would be justified, but they didn't think it would work. So my point here is that the context and the particular circumstance seems tremendously important. It's not that we think that managed relocation is a good idea or a bad idea, but it depends on the situation. So, can we save climate change from biodiversity? Let's actually, I've kind of toured you through a few nuances of this. I tried to raise 3 points that I want you to walk away with. Let's see if we can actually answer the question. Remember, we might do this because we care about species going extinct. But I think we care about a lot of other things that have to do with having the right genetic diversity of the right things in the right place at the right time. And I think that's part of saving biodiversity from climate change also. So, this is going to be a bit of a nuanced answer. Like any good scientist, I'm going to hedge my bets. Here's my answer, no. Can we save biodiversity from climate change? No. Here are some reasons why. Our predictions I showed you are way too simplistic. How am I going to know where I should be doing conservation for my Karner blue butterfly? I don't even know what climates it's adapted to. I'm going to have to do a lot of experimentation. How could you possibly expect me to implement that? At least on in the next decade or 2. We still do not really understand. I argue that there's this idea of realized and fundamental adaptive capacity. But if you asked me to make a list of, say, genes that were involved in that evolvability and adaptive capacity, I can't tell you that. It's going to be a long time till we really wrap our heads around that. We also don't understand adaptive constraints. What is the genomic architecture that would limit the species' ability to, say, evolve to a changing climate? I just showed you here the context dependence. Every situation is going to be different. How can I come up with sweeping rules that will give me guidance? That's going to be really hard. Also, dollars and time are in short supply. I might do managed relocation for this thing here and there, and it might work out great. But what about all the other creatures around the world? Who's going to be looking out for them? And so if we say no to this, we come back to mitigation, 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 which tells us climate change is something that we need to pay attention to, and we need to reduce and ultimately stop greenhouse gas emissions. So all the biologists can go home because we cannot save biodiversity. Here's why I think maybe yes. Yes, we can save biodiversity from climate change. at least we can save some of those critical values that we care about in certain places, in certain times, with tools that we have available to us. So I showed you, scientists are open to new methods, even crazy ideas that 10 years ago we would have said were stupid. Adaptive capacity can be our friend. There are things that we can do to increase from that realized to that fundamental adaptive capacity, and then we let nature do its own thing. So we can help, but nature has creative forces through evolution, for example, and through dispersal. I showed you the risk of invasion from, say, managed relocation as an example strategy might actually be manageable. I showed you it's 14%. Sure, there's risk, but maybe we can actually figure out when it's high and when it's low, and if we're smart, I'm sure we'll screw it up from time to time, but maybe we can kind of work our way through it. And I think we can direct our attention to particular species and ecosystems or functions that we care about, even if we are not going to do this for the totality of life on Earth. So I think this is reason to think that ecologists, conservation biologists have actually something meaningful to contribute to the topic of adaptation. While at the same time, I think it's important for us to remember that climate change is a significant threat that we are not going to work our way through by management alone.
There should be a couple microphones in the room, and we're happy to wander around and take questions, so if anyone wants to kick things off here. While they're thinking about it, while I'm walking up the stairs here, Jessica, I have a quick question for you. You mentioned mitigation, mitigation, mitigation.
Yeah.
I know you're going to COP21, the Paris climate negotiations. What are you going to be doing there is the first part of the question. The second part is, how realistic are you in hoping that something is going to come out of those meetings finally?
Oh. Actually, so what am I going to be doing at the Conference of the Parties? Everyone know what this is? The UN organizes, through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, mandates that annually all of the parties, the signatories to the convention, will come together and negotiate international policy. So here's the partial answer to your second question. It is COP21. COP21. That is crazy. So on that alone, I wouldn't hold a lot of confidence. But it's kind of like how I answered my no and yes, right? Is there going to be a profound global climate agreement that comes out of there? Probably no. But is there so much interesting stuff that is now going on around it? And I think we're increasingly realizing that it's bilateral conversation. It's maybe the developed countries sort of getting together on the side and deciding if I do this and you do that. And the moving away maybe from the global compact idea is a good thing in the end. So that's a partial answer. I'm actually mostly going to be talking about adaptation. We have a side event on the importance of corporate participation in adaptation, and how even though we need mitigation, we're still going to need a little bit of adaptation, even if we were to get our act together tomorrow.
So thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm a geographer, and I primarily work on farming systems in the African context.
Oh.
And one of the challenges we see with adaptation in food production systems is ecologically it may make sense to adapt one way to grow, for example, drought-tolerant crops. But in some cases, because of labor constraints or because of market conditions, people behave in an opposite way. So where I work in southern Africa, it would make sense to grow millet and sorghum as conditions are drying out, but people are growing maize because of labor constraints and in some cases because of markets. And this reminds me a little bit of the tension you described between kind of fundamental adaptation capacity and realized adaptive capacity.
Yeah.
And so my question, I guess, is, as a natural scientist, there's a community of scholars working on adaptation in biological systems. As a social scientist, we're working on it from the other side.
Yes.
And to what degree do you think these two communities are in dialogue with one another? And do they have something to learn from one another? And to what degree do you think that's happening or not, and why?
I think you could give a whole talk on this topic. From my corner of ecology, I do think it's happening because, if you will, the social science, if you will grant me that social science is part of the management practices that, say, federal agencies or landowners are trying to pursue, I think there is recently quite a lot of dialogue between natural scientists who put up theoretical pictures like this and the people who actually have to concern themselves with issues like, is this legally possible? Will people sue us if we do it? In fact, managed relocation, one of the biggest problems with managed relocation is you're going to get sued, which is not scientific at all, right? And you're going to get sued if you do it, and you're going to get sued if you don't do it. So I do think so. But in the international human adaptation environment, I perceive more differences, or more distinction between the social science and the natural science. And I think that's because the social science is just way ahead, in the sense that of appreciating the constraints on this difference between realized and fundamental, right? So you maybe have people working in technological fields saying, well, we can breed this crop, or you should just replace it in the case that you're examining, without much appreciation of the context in which it takes place. I think there's lots of hope. I'd like to work on that topic. One thing we are working on in a project that I didn't talk about is something called the Global Adaptation Index. In that Global Adaptation Index, we're trying to measure the capacity of countries, this adaptive capacity, in terms of socioeconomic readiness, we call it. So we're trying to figure out what are the, and you would undoubtedly have thoughts on this, what are the goodies that societies and countries use that they turn into irrigation potential or crop transitions, or, so what is it that you need? Do you need education? Do you need good governance? You probably need all of these things, right? But what are there any that kind of rise above the level of noise that could bump that, that could make that shift from the realized to the more fundamental? It's talking around your question, but I hope there's something interesting in it. I'd love to talk to you more about it.
Thanks for your talk, Director Hellmann. I'm wondering if you could, you mentioned the rat going across the Golden Gate Bridge, and also later on the, which is great, image, and also the survey results, where people prefer different potential interventions. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more. Adaptation sometimes can seem as sort of, in some circles, as sort of a dirty word compared to sort of mitigation, and sort of how do we communicate about management strategies so that we don't get into that kind of conflict. Like, maybe sort of comments on how we can communicate about adaptation better.
I think we're getting much more sophisticated. So yes, I think and we meaning like the whole society, about this dichotomy between mitigation and adaptation. It's definitely the case. In fact, when we wrote our first papers in 2006 or so, on managed relocation, there were a whole flurry of papers that came out, one in particular that will go unnamed, that says, this is dumb. In fact, we shouldn't even talk about it. I don't think we're there anymore, because I actually think that there's power. We will come back to mitigation. If we really think our way through adaptation, it will bring us back to mitigation. They are two sides of the same coin. So managed relocation undoubtedly involves risk. But I think even more importantly than the risk, it also involves cost. And it's inadequate, right, for the broader problem. And that will bring us back around to mitigation. So I think when we think of them together, and I think policymakers who would think that we're going to solve our way, we'll just grow different crops, right? We're going to solve our way through climate change, haven't thought through adaptation very well. When they do, they will see the constraints, they'll see the economic implications, and they'll realize that reducing greenhouse gases is cheaper and easier.
So I have a question. So you talked about, so I have two questions and they might be kind of related. And one is that process of intervening about species that we particularly care about.
Yes.
How do we decide what species we particularly care about and what interventions might make sense? And the other is, you talked about sort of trying to predict the unexpected consequences. And how do we predict unexpected consequences?
How do we decide which species are worthy of intervention? Here's the answer as I perceive it. It's not the right answer, but I think it's the practical one. There is a federal mandate that says that we're going to. That's the Karner blue, right? Somebody's going to get in trouble if that thing goes extinct. So Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, whoever it is, they better get their act together around it. But you could say, who cares about the Karner blue butterfly? Well, the Federal Endangered Species Act cares. So that sets a legal framework that identifies which ones we're going to care about. The other ones we're going to care about are the ones that somebody makes money off of. So if I'm growing timber, if I'm producing timber in British Columbia and there's a species of tree that will grow better and will produce higher yields in my standard production horizon, then heck, I'm going to, it's a yield question. I have significant incentive to think about increasing my yield. Now, what about all the things in between? There's no legal mandate for the creepy crawlies, the psychonutrients, or maybe there should be. We talk a lot about ecosystem services, but there isn't, short of those that have a market value, I don't know that, we need to work on this problem. And then your second question was, remind me again.
How do you predict unexpected consequences?
Well, I think some unexpected consequences can be anticipated in the sense, for example, when we move things around, we know that we have the possibility of creating pests, right? So that gives us something to talk about. There are probably unanticipated consequences that we can't know that are harder for us to talk about. So I guess I would start with the ones that I think the consequences are unexpected, but the mechanisms or what they're about can be anticipated. So we don't want to ignore the unknown unknowns, but we can work on the known unknowns. I also think, we've been talking about this recently, it occurred to me, Sarah Hobby, who I know said that she was going to watch online, and I were talking, we were both participating in the City of St. Paul's resiliency planning under climate change, which is really an amazing effort and really important. But of course, those conversations always start with what will happen in St. Paul, right? It's going to rain, there will be these strong rainstorms, and stormwater overflow will be a big deal, and it's going to be hot in the summer. And then I said, and someone else also chimed in, but what about all the climate change that is not in St. Paul? That could actually really dictate what happens to St. Paul. It's what happens to commodity prices because of agricultural failure in Africa. What happens if Californians decide that they don't want to be there anymore and they head this way? That'll make stormwater seem like a minor concern. So, or it'll make stormwater, that will be a bigger driver of stormwater than just how much it rains. So there's lots of cool stuff there.
We have time for one more question. Okay, Beth, I'll come
in. The question from Sarah, your discussion makes me think about the international context, and I've heard so much from IonE colleagues about China and the ability of a country that has more central control to address the kind of national issues you just referenced around agriculture in the US. So just wondering, as an ecologist, your comparative sense of context.
I'm not an expert on China. Intuitively, it does seem like top-down, right? We look to China because we think that those top-down processes could be more prominent in places like that. If there was a central decision-making body, you could implement it over a large geography. I guess that's true in principle. I mean, we're starting to see it in terms of energy technology development, for example, in China. But that said, it requires a lot of resources, and so there are serious limitations even on that top-down process, even if you have the political power to execute. But on that last point I was talking about, scale at IonE, I do think that the opposite is important as well. It might surprise us that the grassroots can get a lot done too. And the reason why I say that specific to adaptation is because though climate change is a global phenomenon, right? You release a molecule of CO2 over here, it has a warming effect around the world. Adaptation is not at all a global phenomenon, it's highly local. And so though you can't control the Californians that might move to Minnesota, you do have a certain amount of ability to influence, you know, your farm field or your forest or your town. I mean, you're embedded in an international context, but it might be that countries where citizens decide to take up this issue in a very proactive way, that could be just as profound perhaps than a top-down approach. Time will tell.
All right, please join me in thanking Jessica for a wonderful